I received a request or suggestion on the channel to do a page through of the Classic Dungeon Design Guide. And it occurred to me when I read that I guess I made an assumption that a lot of people knew what this book is and that wasn't necessary. And it also came, the request that is, at a very good time because I'm sort of between longer, more involved videos right now. And so I I'm doing it. I got the comment the other day and I'm filming this right away. So thank you to that viewer who made the suggestion. I'm actually not just going to talk about this classic dungeon design guide, but I'm going to talk about two other books as well in the series, but we will go through the books. You've seen them, or at least this one for sure, and probably some of the others on the channel if you've watched the channel. I use them often, so often that I can't even put references to the videos where they may appear in this video, but we'll take a closer look at this book and two other really useful resources for the soloist and for RPGers in general. I actually have three books by this author, Kent David Kelly, and I do use the first volume the most, and this was the most, I sort of bought them in this order, and I will look through all of them. I believe there might be others that he's done. I purchased these online at Amazon, and I think they're still available there. They are essentially self-published. Castle Old Skull is given as the publisher here, and we'll take a look first at how he describes it. Behold the Netherworld. If you have ever wanted to know how to quickly and masterfully create your own mega dungeon for your favorite fantasy role-playing game, this is the perfect book for you. Herein you will find thousands of ideas inspired by, and then he goes on to list the greats of the RPG field, as well as some literary greats. An infinite imagination engine fully geared for dungeon design is at your fingertips. And the the worst thing about the book, I'll say, is the beginning and the table of contents, because he starts by saying, first of all, clearly this is not an RPG, and I don't think anyone looking at this video would think that, but I will state this clearly. This is not a game in and of itself, and it doesn't have any rules either. It is essentially a series of random tables, and the contents are just sort of a little off-putting the way they're organized. They're very lengthy and not so useful, frankly, as you can see as I page through them. But the book itself is quite useful, and we'll just look at some of the tables. A lot of them in here are D100 tables. I think in the traps table there's even bigger. In the traps volume, the tables are even bigger. I like the D100 myself. It's just easy. I have those dice. When it gets to like a D1000 table, I find that less useful. In any event, here is a table of plot hooks, and I'm not going to read a ton of these. I suppose if you want, you can pause the video and look at some of them. They are pretty, they're generic enough. So here's one: a vile curse, an infernal strain of lycanthropy, a cursed sword which cannot be dropped, an incurable wasting disease, etc. So he's sort of giving you the general framework, and then you can use that to build in what you want, what fits with your story. Afflicted one of the adventurers in the last scenario, and the only cure to be found is in a distant dungeon. So what's nice about that one, I just chose that randomly, is it does give a sense of something that happened to the adventurers in the past. And if you watch my channel enough, you know that I think it's extremely important to at least give a sense of a feel that there has been a history for your adventurers, and often a history to the physical space that they're in, because right away having that is going to give some narrative thickness to what you're doing and help you have a richer foundation for your story. And ultimately, if you're watching this as a soloist, and even if you're not, if you're watching this as a regular GM, you know that having the the richness of a story and the comfort in thinking there's something to go back to with your narrative is very important for generating exciting sessions. So here in this particular one, it's kind of giving you that suggestion built in. And here we'll look at the one more, exploring the unknown. The players are simply enticed by a remarkable environment, a crystal, and again, he gives examples, a crystal maze filled with waterfalls, a fungal garden being tamed by druids and beastmasters, an underground sea plied by ships with spider silk sails, etc. And they have a wish to explore it. The lure to this area can be a map, a vision in a crystal or a dream, a strange inscription, or simply a dramatic overlook view described by the GM. Again, you can see within, fairly short paragraph here, there are a lot of suggestions made that can be very evocative and useful and really food for thought. If you just sat down at the table and just did your D100 here and said, this is what I'm going to play, or I'm going to base my session around it, maybe you would even base the rule set that you chose around that. There is a list of scenario twists here that, for example, the dungeon the group was expecting is not the one they discover. And then again, he gives nice examples. They fall into a pit, open a secret trapdoor, and look out into an upside-down cavern wilderness filled with butterflies and cave dinosaurs. So he doesn't just give the general prompt, but he walks you a little bit into it. There's a list of benefactors. The benefactor in gaming parlance is the NPC who provides an incentive for the PCs to go on the adventure. We all know about that if we have played any manner of RPGs. And so it says here, there's the list, obviously. The GM will need to tailor the results to mesh appropriately with the campaign setting. And there are a mysterious ethereal woman riding a griffin. Not a lot of description here, but the family of one of the party's henchmen. Enough to perhaps give you something to begin to weave a narrative from. There are some tables here for the chaotically random benefactor. So you could just basically descriptors. These are descriptors of what the benefactor could be. One table that I know that I use a lot here, these are setting the scene, this unusual basis of operation. It says typically the adventurers will either be based in their favorite campaign city or in the last town, village, castle where they were healing and recovering from the last adventure. At times, however, the GM can create an interesting atmosphere by telling the players that their heroes have been traveling for a specific purpose and have just arrived at the last civilized place nearest to the dungeon. So this is giving you, again, this is part of, say, it could be part of the past, or it could be part of the story of one of the adventurers, one of the party, a bustling barge city at the confluence of two rivers. That gives you some possibilities for travel. It could be a magisterial castle in the clouds, populated by only 9 souls. Something very, very different. Again, these are the kinds of things you would roll up at the beginning of a session or a campaign, because it would impact the rest of what you were doing. Some rumor topics, sampling from the rumor mongers. Here we have, this is a little bit of sort of overland stuff. It says, the majority of dungeon adventurers typically begin with the PCs plopped directly in front of the entrance, following a quick preamble. However, classic adventurers and dungeon modules once used a significantly wider array of approaches, and this is sort of bringing you to the dungeon. And again, you can see here, just even with the length of the entries, that you're getting some story here, or at least the beginnings of a story here. We have, continuing with this theme, unusual wilderness encounters. A lone trapper dressed in silver furs bumbles out of the forest, engaging on a drunken rant with the strongest looking adventurer. In the deep of the night, one of the exhausted adventurers on sentry duty hears an urgent whisper from behind, "You fool, not yet." So these are could be pretty generative, I think, for a story for the soloist looking to take their story somewhere. Which direction was the dungeon built? So this particular one goes into great detail about the specifics of constructing a dungeon, the history, who were the first builders, who came next. There's a lot of atmospheric tables here for sounds and for the materials that the dungeons are made out of. And we're talking here even about the type of air that is in the dungeon, and water and food and light. And then, of course, who lives in the dungeon. And there are subsections here, so you could have different types of caves, if your dungeon is going to be a cave, if it's going to be castle or a manor house under a manor house. And chapter 5 says creating the dungeon delve, and talks about drawing the dungeon, things that might not necessarily be of necessity, but they're here if you want to even follow that. We'll skip ahead a little bit to show you there's the depth of the dungeon, concepts and themes. So there's a random table here for different themes about what your dungeon could possibly be. And then it says a good dungeon is not just a series of rooms. It features unexpected areas which make somewhat logical sense, while still offering the players unanticipated options and restrictions. So we have winding passages, irregular room shapes. These are going to be developed as tables in this section. Interrupted claustrophobia, multiple exits. He gives you some rules if you want to develop your real mega dungeon and have a system of different levels and map them all out. And putting in various monster populations to different parts of the dungeon. You have a table here that is full of that. And we get into the interior conditions of the room, the climate, the terrain. All aspects of the condition in a dungeon are covered here, really. Overall light, the light sources. I've used some of this in my videos, I think. Air clarity, air currents. It seems like that might be a minor detail, but it really does add a lot to think about. There's even the concept, there's moss growing here. Right away, that gives you, at least it gives me, some idea about a feeling for what this location might be. Odors in a dungeon. Intermittent sounds, the beating of wings, clicking, grating, grinding stone, some sort of rattling. Again, it allows your mind to wander, and that is really a beautiful thing about this book. The lure of an empty room. A good classic dungeon will feature many empty rooms. Too many novice GMs make sure there is something exciting, immediate, and visceral in every room. But the problem is that if there's something everywhere, you lose a little bit of surprise. And there is a section on different types of rooms, classic and unusual room types, to generate different types of rooms. Earlier we saw the overall section where he was referring to the caverns, the manor house, the stronghold, the temple, the tomb. You can roll on that to see what type of dungeon you're going to have if you want, and then go to that specific section. So if you have caverns, there are different cavern areas. If it is a traditional dungeon, they're here. Manor house areas will be listed on this table: a hall of mirrors, a day room, a dining room, a crawl space. More manor house areas: a storeroom with meat. Stronghold areas: the ice house, a royal chamber, a scullery. And we have then adjectives to describe random rooms. I've definitely used this quite a bit. I find that this table is very useful in giving me just the one word, diabolical or glowing, is going to help me think about what could be happening story-wise in that particular place. And we get even more into details. There's furnishings here. I think you're seeing the depth of this book. Features of curiosity, an animal skeleton, a rusted blade, some swaying chimes. Obviously, you wouldn't necessarily roll on every single table in this book, every single room, every single thing you were doing. But being familiar with the tables in the book that speak the most to you. And when I picked this book up, I took it off, but I had a bunch of Post-it notes on certain of the tables because those are the ones that over the years I have gravitated toward, and just kind of having a sense or a memory of what might be in there provides you with a quick way to reach for the book and get what you need out of it. More features of curiosity: mud, edible mushrooms, a magic circle that's broken, for example. Steps within a room, a pile of stones, or a trail of breadcrumbs. There's all types of doors, corridors and connections, and it goes on. He's walking you through basically how he would develop a dungeon or a campaign, and that could be useful as an exercise. I think I haven't really referred to it that much myself, but it is in this book. So that's a look inside the Classic Dungeon Design Guide by Kent David Kelly. That this is the one of the three. It's the first one I bought, and it's the one that I use the most still. All right, and now we move on to the Classic Dungeon Design Guide Book 2. It begins with a warning. This book assumes that you own Book 1, the one we just looked at. It references concepts, chapters, and systems used in that volume. So, why does this book exist? Well, it explains that most old school Renaissance gamers and game masters love to play adventures in sprawling mega dungeons, but few people possess the mental stamina required to build them all the way down, and that this book will be your toolbox for doing that. Every GM needs assistance with different parts of the details, with the nuts and the bolts. So it says, whereas Book 1 was mostly a conceptual guide, this is the workbook that helps you sit down and turn the ideas into reality. The books in the series, he's talking about the rest of the books. So how do you use this book? You can read straight through from the beginning, proceed to the end and stop. That's always good advice. Or you can go back to the table of contents and find what works for you best. Chapter 2, Quarters and Themes for Dungeon NPCs. So he talks here about lots of classic old school dungeons are filled with large rooms replete with beds, footlockers, weapons racks, guard pots, and lots of low-level minions. And here are ideas for the population of that. Now, this book, and I think also the Dungeon Traps ones, uses this D1000 roll, although it doesn't have 1,000 different entries. It has less than that, but presumably more than 100, which is why he went to that other table. So you're rolling and then looking at a group of things. And I don't know why, but for some reason I always prefer D1. Like, to me, this feels slightly overwhelming, and maybe that's partially why I haven't used this book as much. And maybe partially it's also just the content of it. So this is a D1000 table of something that you could have as just almost like flavor or background NPCs, or you could have actual minions and things running around. But for me as a soloist, that's a little bit much to manage. So you have drudge workers, dwarfs, explorers. Again, these are meant to be kind of groups of people in the dungeon: infantry, lackeys, laborers, militia. And more detail for your mega dungeon here with another table that lists different, I would say, like types of, almost like bureaucrats or something, or not just bureaucrats, but types of people that would be in an environment, in a community, in a mega dungeon community, not the kings, queens, and emperors, but sort of like everybody else in the population. So we have artisans, but we also have fighters, and we have half ogres and illusionists. Not a lot of, not really any detail here, but really just a list of different things. So then it gets into different types of NPCs that could be in a mega dungeon, and this isn't so much a random table as just a list based on the experience level that you would want them to have, and then the name or the type that they would be. And he even says here at the beginning of this section, that this is not offering a lot of detail, and if you want more detail about, say, for example, what an arch villain could be, you would have to kind of go elsewhere. He has a list of different types of assassins, barbarians, bards, cavaliers, and so on, different types of clerics. So, and I mean, I think you can sort of see if you watch my channel, sort of why this book ended up not being as fruitful for me as the other one. But for a different type of GM or solo GM, I think it could be extremely useful if you're really trying to quickly come up with like a whole sort of populace that is surrounding the experiences of the particular party that you're having. We have mystics here, paladins, rangers, and so on. Then he moves into interesting details. This kind of covers some of the material in the other book for caves, grottos, tunnels, monster lair, or netherworld locations. And you have a calcified skeleton with treasure, ? Centipedes, a swarm or monstrous, flies, fleas, a dead monster. Again, this could be very vague. A dead monster you'd have to sort of figure out how that fit into your story. Some salt formations, a sloping floor. Is it a trap? ? Do not know. Designing an interesting container. That's very detailed and small, but could be useful. But again, it's like he'll say just hamper. Doesn't really tell you too much. A hanging net or a jug. You would really need to then continue rolling, I guess, to get the material and who made that material, who made that jug, which may or may not fit into your campaign, what is in the contents of it. So you could find some dead leaves in it. Pretty specific, yet on some level, it's just such a minor detail. It might seem challenging to develop a narrative around it. Like, where is the location? Well, it's in the container. It's in an adjacent card, or it's in a pit, or it's magically floating. You have some tables for creating the details of a corpse or a skeleton that would be found, and a curious object that might be found on it. This is more focused on the individuals, or in this case, former individuals that would have been in the space. Some more tables on doors or portals, an archway. It could be ice, cracked ice, a one-way door. Could be part of a fresco. It would be up to you very much to take this prompt and develop some story from it, or not, or maybe just have that information. It's an earth door. It's made out of mud. There's a broken wooden lockpick on it. And so he says here, for example, for the random dungeon dressing table here, I've already created this in the first book, so why do I offer this new system? Basically to give you more options. And he has a list of useful questions here about that one could ask oneself. And it's always good to remember this as the soloist, because the answers to these questions can get you out of narrative dead ends. Why is this here? What was its original purpose? Who was first responsible for it? Why was it left behind? Is it just random trash, or is it a subtle clue to something secret? Does it point to a treasure, trap, trick, monster, NPC, or secret location elsewhere? These are a great list of questions that one could ask oneself in many instances here, and they're linked here to some specifics of rolling up some objects: a blood stain, a hollow ceiling, a chandelier, a random dagger, a dresser or dried flower. So there are many different options here. And asking the questions of these, a spool of wire, asking those questions: whose was it? Why was it here? Why is it still here? Is it pointing towards something else? That could be very effective in generating some narrative. We have a list here, some more descriptors, adjectives from the options. You get 5 options for each of your die rolls, and you could choose some of these adjectives. And this is a very useful table because you can sort of never have enough choices when it comes to just that one extra word that's going to help turn something from just a door into a polished door. Why is it polished? Is it special in some way? Who polished it? Designing an elaborate fountain or pool room. This table is designed to give mystical and magical results above all. It's also specifically crafted to introduce large numbers of aquatic monsters into the dungeon setting, because those classic monsters tend to be criminally underused in games where PCs rarely go on maritime adventures. So we have features of a fountain, pool, or statue motif, the watercolor consistency or quality, the water effect. This could be interesting even if you were just having, the kind of classic fountain in a room that people find. And then the water denizens or additional decorations. Let's actually do a little rolling here just to see what we could get. Because, for example, you could have this fountain or pool room become the goal of your adventurers, to find something there, or retrieve something there and bring it somewhere. So if we did this, we've got 10. Now, there's choices here. So we have animating statue intelligent. That is right away, that is something that I think I could form as the basis of a story. 77, shadow filled. And then the water effect, 52, is intelligent. So that actually works well together. I think that's oh, and the water denizen. Let's see what we got there. We got a 1, none. So it's some type of animated intelligent fountain. Unfortunately, it doesn't have anything in it. I might re-roll that to give myself it has a sea monster or a serpent, random small. This could be the basis of a goal, a side quest, or your entire quest. And then we have designing a fearsome fungus, slime, or abomination. You can't ever have an epic dungeon without randomly chaotic slimes. That's true. They're the perfect monsters to possess random powers, appearances, and attributes. So I think this is also a D100 table. We're rolling so low here. Animated and sentient crystalline material. And it has an unnerving feature of it is fanged. That's pretty unnerving to have some random fangs in a slime. And wow, really rolling low. Always wins initiative in combat. And it has a weakness, and the weakness is holy magic or symbols. I'm not sure how that would be a weakness, but again, or vulnerability, maybe it's guarding something there. You could see where this would add a little depth and detail to a particular section of your dungeon. Designing a rogue's or villain's secret hideout. Hideouts are ideal dungeon locations where an NPC or other intelligent monster creates a base of operations. Again, if you were, say, creating a situation where you were traveling somewhere or bringing something or taking something, whatever, this would give you some details. Designing an unforgettable laboratory, magic room, or wizard's chamber, same kind of thing. As you can see when I'm using this, the layout here is a little bit, it's not quite as easy to discern as the other, this paragraph form, but I guess it was done because in part, at least some of these tables, for length, because the book is already pretty long. Designing a mind-blowing magical gateway. Magical gateways are a quick way for wayward adventurers to leave or move about the dungeon. And it's giving you the subsections of the table here. There's the different types that there could be. Again, a lot of animated here. Reflecting pool with swirling vapors, a shimmering surface. There's some scrolls or earthen rumblings, sinkholes. It's control or restriction. So this is going to give some, well, as it says, restriction as to what it ages the journeyers during the passage, or it drains the magic items during a passage, or only mages can go through it. Unorthodox ? Destination. It could be into the sky, into a dragon's lair, elemental's lair, things of this nature. You can see this book is larger in scope, literally, realm to the far south, than the other one. And for me as a solo player, the way that I play, not as useful, but certainly for other players it could be. But if you are trying to flesh out a whole world or create an entire backstory, it could be very useful here. Designing an otherworldly museum, menagerie, or gallery. It says this is an experimental table which is still in development in my own campaign. And it says, as such, I recommend using this table only occasionally, perhaps once per dungeon setting, and you will need to make sure the room is guarded and difficult to reach. So I think this is like a menagerie, a collection of things, and you could just roll on this sort of for fun and create something atmospheric that maybe it's just in the backdrop of your story and doesn't even actually exist. This group of random monsters held in some menagerie somewhere or museum. Prominent items in a museum collection. Eggs, elven crabs, a butterfly, carnivorous, dangerous plants, herbs, monster parts. This could be useful. You could find a room, say a treasure trove room in a dungeon, and in it could be some of these things, and you could determine whether or not they would be useful to you. Designing a rescue-worthy prisoner, captor, or survivor, and their class, their archetype, their motivation, why their descriptor or complication. They're ultra powerful. They're chained to a wall. They have paranoid delusions. Again, possibly very useful. Designing a momentous shrine or altar. Then it gets into a deity philosophy if you're creating holy and unholy symbols, and this alignment, details, summary of domains of worship, other things, in sphere of influence. This could actually be useful at the outset of a session. I haven't used it, but could be useful at the outset of a session to create a sort of philosophical backdrop to the world, if it is a place of discord or where everything is betrayal. Or so, for example, if it was earthquake, if you rolled up earthquakes, it wouldn't necessarily need to be literally earthquakes, but it could just be the instability of any structure you came across, or the instability of the land, the physical land, that is. Back to the altar, the original purpose of the altar's material. So this book just takes you a little bit deeper into certain details of a dungeon that you may be designing. And then the last one that I have, and again, I feel as if there may be more, so you should check that out, and I'll check that out too, but is this book of the book of dungeon traps. Again, the warning, this book is not a rule set. Would you like to fill your dungeon with traps, but you can never find coherent rules or guidelines to show the way? Includes rules for trap placement, triggers, detection, removal, Every trap type features detailed rules which have been culled from dozens of books and design modules, turning hidden and obscure rulings into a methodical and internally consistent system for trap design. And again, a lengthy table of contents here. There is a trap compendium, a collection of classic dungeon traps alphabetically from Acid Jet to Wind Gust. There's random trap selection, and by level and lethality, trap-related monsters. Introduction, the role of traps. Traps lie at the very core of classic dungeon design. Secondary only to monsters, they form the crux of peril and atmosphere in the FRPG underworld. The problem with traps in a game master's dungeon design, however, are many. Hard to design, hard to balance, easy to make too lethal. And after the first dozen or so you wing off the top of your head, hard to conceive of, differentiate, and create. This book is designed to change all of that. And then he talks about to understand the place, role, and utility of this book, is helpful to consider what a dungeon is really comprised of. All dungeons feature 4 major construction elements: rooms, corridors, doors, and stairs. They're filled with 5 basic types of content: dungeon dressing, which is descriptive atmosphere, monsters, treasure, tricks, and traps. Traps and tricks are typically discussed in the same breath, but they are completely different, and he goes on to talk further about that. Traps can generally be divided into 2 subtypes, mechanical and magical, with magical traps predominating due to the variety. And then he goes on to talk about the lack of existing resources on traps, trap balance, etc. So the most important concept to understand is progression. So he's very focused here on the lethality of traps and how this can be related to the level of the party. Each trap in this book is given a numeric lethality level, ranging from 0, which is incapable of causing damage, to 10, which is fatal. And he is giving ranges here of the damage inflicted and some recommendations for what particular level, and then one example of what that type might be. So, for example, a 10-foot deep pit that inflicts 6 to 10 HP would be listed here as a level 2, and the level 5 pit is 60 feet deep, and it could inflict 31 to 40 HP, and it gives the example this could kill level 1, 2, or 3 characters, whereas this one would kill most level 1 characters. But level 2 characters might be wounded, but maybe could escape that. All right, we'll skip through this, and they're talking about every game master has a different opinion about how frequently traps should be used within a dungeon. And he gives a baseline, which we won't necessarily go into, but he does give some recommendations for this. And this could be very useful if you are playing, and I think this could be very useful. You may not necessarily agree. I mean, he says about 1 in 20 rooms and corridors should have a trap. Now, typically when I'm playing, and many rules will suggest rolling much more frequently than that, but this is his recommendation here, and I guess for higher levels he's suggesting a greater frequency, but I guess I play in dangerous low-level dungeons a lot. Where to place traps. He talks about this. Often traps are on doors, but it says here he's giving you some suggestions about different places to put traps. If you do not have a specific location in mind for the trap, you can roll this D100. It could be on a corpse, a corridor, a door, of course, but it could be in a secret room, a staircase. That's something that I don't think of often. What is triggering the trap? And he's got a flood level delayed timer, a magic proximity detection, a pressure plate, tripwire, unseen servant. Some rules about trap detection, which this may not be useful to you if you're playing with your own rule set, but maybe you're playing with a rule set that doesn't specifically have a rule for trap detection, and so if you happen to be playing one of these characters, like a dwarf or an elf or whatever, you could use these percentage. Similarly, giving some suggestions for how to deactivate or remove the traps. And then we get into the alphabetical listing of the traps. So each of the traps, so for here is an acid trap, you're given options here for what the different lethality would be and where the jet may be. Now, it is numbered as if you could roll on this as a D10 table, although I'm not sure that would necessarily work if you, I mean, I suppose your first level encounters, your first level adventurers could encounter a lethality 5 trap and try to escape it, but that might be a recipe for disaster if you totally did this randomly. There are within here, for example, there's ranges here. This one will alert the monsters and they're going to be on guard, but they're not going to come investigate, whereas this one, they will show up. Arrow traps, and it gives some description here or discussion here about how you could employ this differently, what happens if it misses, and where it would be. It could be possibly poisoned. Boiling mud, boiling water, bolt traps, bridge traps, ceiling traps, crushing, lowering with spikes, a pillar collapsing, contact poison, diseased corpses could create that, corridor blocks, dart traps, deadfalls, door traps, of course, one-way doors, dust traps. There's enchanted runes. Unlike most runes, the explosive runes must be hidden in other written information. Clever GMs can include wall mosaics, tapestries, or other room furnishings in this definition. That's kind of cool. Little rules for symbols. What happens if you try to detect what this is? Entangling vines, fire traps, flood, floor, flesh grubs. These are monsters. Fungi, gas traps in general, discussion of what gases could do and how they might be avoided. And let's just skip ahead. A hobbling hole. A hobbling hole is a collapsing plate or similar niche which causes someone's foot to become trapped. A variant can tempt a character to put a hand in a small area. So here we are. The random trap selection system. This might have, I think I probably would have put this first, but nevertheless, so what you could do is say we're looking here for levels 1 adventurers, so we're going to roll our D100 table, and we get a 16, which is going to bring us to table 6.2. So we're going to go to table 6.2. We're going to roll on this table, 28. We got a deactivated trap. Okay, so actually a non-trap. But let's say we didn't roll that. And even a deactivated trap actually could be good. If you were doing this and going through a dungeon, you could explore it. You could roll again to see what kind of deactivated trap it is. Maybe you could take some parts from it. We rolled a 12. So we have an already triggered trap. Okay, same kind of deal. If we rolled a 51, we would get a gust of wind, etc. And I guess then we would go back to the alphabetical here, and I'm thinking we're going to see a gust of wind trap. Well, there's the wind gust. That was confusing. Wind gust, gust of wind, probably should have been consistent. Anyway, then you would go back to it. And it says here, the following tables provide a fair random spread of dangerous yet reasonable traps by lethality level so that unavoidable death traps are rarely, if ever, encountered. And that is how it works. Could have been a little more clearly organized, I think, but to be fair, I have not used this in my actual play. So let's see. If we're going here, we'll give, 1 acid jet. Well, I know there was an acid jet here. So then you would find the acid jet. Now we're looking at for level 3, so I guess you would just go to this level 3 since you rolled there. Again, not totally clear because this could also be 1 to 3 and 1 to 10. Maybe it needs a little finessing, but nevertheless, this is, you can see if you're interested in making more detailed traps and not your standard sort of dart trap, which is like the thing that comes to mind, or just locked door or whatever. That's the book of dungeon traps. So that's a look inside these 3 volumes. Heartily recommend checking them out if they seem of interest to you. Certainly the Classic Dungeon Design Guide is one of my go-to books when I'm thinking about starting a session or if I need something in a session, but all 3 of them offer a wealth of information for GMs.